They say the ocean is a graveyard that keeps its peace, that when a ship goes down, the water eventually settles and the silence returns. But there is a strait in the Philippines where the silence is a lie. We all know the story of the Titanic. We know the ice, the luxury, and the hubris, but the Titanic is not the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history, not even close. In December 1987, 4,000 people boarded a ferry called the Doña Pass. They were families, students, and workers, trusting a calm sea to carry them home for Christmas. They didn't know that they were sailing into a trap. They didn't know that by midnight, the ocean wouldn't just be deep, it would be burning. This is a story about what happens when the systems we trust collapse into an inferno. It is the story of the invisible passengers, the ghost ship that struck them, and the man who had to decide whether to burn on the deck or jump into a sea of fire. So, settle in. Let the world outside fade away. Join me as we uncover the tragedy that history tried to forget. This is the story of the burning ocean. There are places in the world where the horizon is not a line, but a promise. It is a flat, infinite edge where the sky meets the water, and for those who live on islands, it is the only road they know. The sea is not merely a landscape to be admired from a beach, it is a highway, a marketplace, and a graveyard. In the Philippines, an archipelago shattered into more than 7,000 islands, the ocean is the blood that connects the body of the nation. It is the vast, blue silence that separates a mother from her child, a worker from his home, and the present from the future. To cross it is to surrender control. You hand your life over to the machine. You step off the solid earth, dragging a suitcase bound with rope, and you step onto steel plates that groan under the weight of thousands. You trust the steel. You trust the engine's heartbeat. You trust the men in the white uniforms who stand high above on the bridge, looking out at the dark water. You trust that the ocean is indifferent, that it does not care if you live or die, and in that indifference there is a kind of safety. Because the ocean has always been there. It has been crossed 1,000,000 times before. The ferry leaves the port, the whistle blows, and the city lights fade. You find a corner on the deck, you close your eyes, and you assume that tomorrow will come. But assumptions are fragile things. They are built on the belief that the world makes sense, that systems work, and that disasters are things that happen to other people, in other times, on other ships. We tell ourselves that technology has tamed the wild things. We believe that because we have radar and radios and manifests, we have conquered the dark. But the dark is patient. It waits for a moment of arrogance, it waits for a moment of fatigue, and on December 20th, 1987, the dark was waiting in the Tablas Strait. It was the season of return. In the Philippines, Christmas is not just a holiday, it is a gravitational force. It pulls millions of people out of the cities, out of the factories of Manila, and drags them back to the provinces, to the villages of their birth. The port of Manila in December is a study in desperation. It is a sweltering, chaotic hive of humanity. There is the smell of diesel fumes, of drying fish, of sweat, and of anxiety. Tickets are sold out weeks in advance. Scalpers whisper prices in the shadows. Families sleep on the concrete piers, waiting for a chance to board, waiting for a ship that will take them home before the 25th. The weather reports were good. The sky was clear. The sea was calm. This is the detail that haunts the survivors most of all. There was no typhoon. There were no towering waves crashing over the bow. The ocean was a sheet of black glass reflecting the stars. It was the kind of night that sailors love, the kind of night that lulls a crew into a false sense of security. It was a night that felt innocent. Into this innocence walked a man named Paquito Osabel. He was 42 years old. He was not a wealthy man, nor was he a destitute one. He was simply a man who needed to get home. He had a family waiting in the south, in Catbalogan. He had obligations. He had the quiet, stoic determination of a man who has spent his life working within a system that demands patience. Paquito was one face in a crowd of thousands. If you looked at the pier that day, you would not have noticed him. He was not shouting. He was not fighting for a space. He was just moving with the current of bodies flowing up the gangway of the ship that loomed above them. The ship was the Doña Paz. To the people on the dock, she was a massive, comforting presence, a steel island. She was painted white, standing out against the grime of the harbor. She was a veteran of these waters, a reliable workhorse that had made this run up and down the coast countless times. She was the ship everyone knew. If you lived in the Visayas, you had probably been on her, or you knew someone who had. She was part of the infrastructure of life, as common as a bus or a jeepney, but the Doña Paz had a history that the passengers did not know. She began her life in Japan years earlier under the name Hime Yuri Maru. She was designed to carry roughly 600 people. When she was sold to the Philippine lines, she was modified, refitted, expanded. The capacity was increased on paper to 1,518. That was the official number. That was the legal limit. But laws, on the docks of Manila in December, are merely suggestions. As Paquito Osabel stepped onto the deck, he did not see a ship adhering to legal limits. He saw a city in compression. The overcrowding was not subtle. It was overwhelming. Every square inch of the vessel was claimed. The cabins were full, 4 to a bunk. The hallways were lined with cots. The stairwells were clogged with people sitting on their luggage. But it didn't stop there. The open decks, exposed to the air, were carpeted with bodies. There were woven mats spread out on the steel floor. Families created small territories with their bags, walling off a few feet of space to eat, to sleep, to exist for the 24-hour journey. There were chickens in crates, clucking softly in the heat. There were baskets of fruit. There were televisions tied up in boxes, gifts for relatives back home. And there were children, so many children. They ran through the narrow corridors between the sleeping mats. They sat on their parents' laps. They slept curled up on top of suitcases. And here is the first secret of the Doña Paz. The manifest was a lie. The official list of passengers, the paper trail that the authorities would later cling to, bore no resemblance to the reality on the deck. Children under the age of 4 often traveled for free or for a nominal fee, and so they were not listed. Extra tickets were sold illegally by crew members for cash, pocketed quietly. The passengers waved aboard without a record. The capacity was 1,518, but as the sun began to set that evening, the number of souls on board was double that, perhaps triple. No one counted. No one wanted to count. To count would be to acknowledge the danger, and everyone just wanted to get home. Paquito found a spot. It wasn't a cabin. It was a patch of floor. He settled in. He watched the city of Manila drift away, the lights of the skyline shrinking until they were just a glow on the horizon. The ship picked up speed, the engines vibrating through the soles of his feet. It is a specific sensation, that vibration. It numbs the body. It becomes a white noise that drowns out thought. The psychology of the passenger is a strange thing. When you board a plane, you watch the safety demonstration. You look for the exit. You are aware, even if only in the back of your mind, that you are in a metal tube 30,000 feet in the air. But on a ferry in the warm tropics, that fear dissolves. The water feels accessible, it's right there. You can smell the salt. You feel that if something were to go wrong, you would simply float. The danger feels theoretical, distant. Nobody on the Doña Paz was talking about lifeboats. In fact, the lifeboats were locked away, or seized up with rust and layers of paint, or filled with supplies. The life jackets were stowed in lockers that were padlocked shut to prevent theft. Safety was an obstacle to convenience. As the night deepened, the ship transformed. The chaotic energy of boarding settled into a low rhythmic hum. The humidity of the day broke slightly, replaced by the cooling breeze of the open sea. On the bridge, the mood was casual. We must imagine the bridge not as a center of high-tension command, but as a living room. The captain, a veteran seaman, was eventually reported to be watching a movie on a Betamax player in his cabin, or perhaps he was just resting. He had left the bridge in the hands of his subordinates. This was not unusual. It was standard practice. The route through the Tablas Strait is wide. It is deep. It is devoid of complicated reefs or narrow channels that require constant, white-knuckled piloting. It is a straight line through the dark. Why worry? The radar was spinning, sweeping the horizon with its invisible beam, a green line sweeping in a circle, painting the empty world. The crew on the bridge drank beer. They chatted. One apprentice was at the helm. It was a job. It was a shift. They were moving through a void, and the void was empty. Except the void was not empty. Miles away, moving in the opposite direction, coming from the south and heading north toward Manila, was another shape. It was smaller than the Doña Paz, but denser. It sat low in the water. It was the motor tanker Vector. If the Doña Paz was a floating city, the Vector was a floating bomb. It was a small tanker chartered to carry fuel, and on this night its belly was full. It was carrying 8,800 barrels of petroleum products, gasoline, diesel, kerosene, more than 1 million liters of volatile, flammable liquid sloshing in the tanks as the ship cut through the swells. The Vector was not just dangerous because of what it carried. It was dangerous because of what it was. It was a ghost ship. Later investigations would reveal that the Vector was operating without a license. It had no lookouts. It had no qualified master on the bridge. The man steering the ship was underqualified, perhaps overworked, perhaps just as complacent as the crew on the ferry. The Vector was sailing blind. Its navigation lights were dim or perhaps entirely extinguished. It moved through the darkness like a shadow. It did not announce itself. It did not declare its poison. It just pushed forward, a dark arrow aiming for the heart of the strait. 2 vessels, one carrying 4,000 people, sleeping, dreaming of Christmas, trusting the machine. The other carrying 1 million liters of fire, operating outside the law. They were on the same line of longitude. They were occupying the same slice of the ocean. And the ocean, vast as it is, has a way of shrinking. It is a paradox of the sea. You can sail for weeks and see nothing, and yet collision courses exist. They are mathematical traps. If 2 lines intersect and the timing is precise, the vastness of the water becomes irrelevant. All that matters is the point of intersection. The time was approaching 10 o'clock at night. On the Doña Paz, the noise had died down. The canteen was closing. The movie in the salon was ending. People were curled up on their mats. The air was thick with the sound of breathing, the smell of human bodies, and the salty draft from the sea. Paquito Osabel was likely awake or dozing lightly, listening to the wash of the waves against the hull. High above on the bridge of the ferry, the radar should have shown a blip, a small glowing dot representing the Vector. But radar requires interpretation. It requires eyes that are looking for danger. If the crew was distracted, if they were tired, if they were confident that the sea was theirs alone, the dot would go unnoticed. Or perhaps they saw it and assumed it was a fishing boat, something small that would get out of their way. Big ships have the right of way by the sheer physics of tonnage. They assumed the other vessel would turn. On the Vector, the view was equally dark. They were plowing north. Did they see the lights of the ferry? The Doña Paz would have been lit up like a Christmas tree, deck lights blazing. It should have been impossible to miss. But fatigue is a blinder. Complacency is a fog. The distance closed. 10 miles, 5 miles, 1 mile. In the open ocean, a mile is nothing. It is crossed in minutes. The physics of large ships means that by the time you see the danger with your naked eye, it is often already too late. Momentum is a cruel master. You cannot stop a steel island in the water. You cannot turn it on a dime. It slides. It drifts. It carries its weight forward regardless of the panic in the wheelhouse. We enter the final seconds. Imagine the silence of the bridge broken by a sudden realization. A shout, perhaps. A frantic spin of the wheel. The sudden horrifying clarity of a shape emerging from the gloom. The silhouette of the tanker, low and black, appearing directly in the path of the towering white ferry. There was no time for an alarm. There was no time to wake the passengers. There was no time to unlock the life jackets or lower the boats. The systems that were supposed to protect the people, the regulations, the watches, the protocols, had all evaporated hours ago. All that was left was physics. The bow of the Vector slammed into the port side of the Doña Paz. It was not a glancing blow. It was a T-bone collision. The tanker drove itself into the ferry like a spear. Metal screamed. It is a sound unlike anything else on Earth. The tearing of steel plates, the buckling of iron frames, a screech that vibrated through the entire structure of the ship, waking 4,000 people in a single heartbeat. The impact shook the Doña Paz violently. People were thrown from their bunks. Luggage toppled. Children rolled across the decks. The lights flickered and died, plunging the interior of the ship into absolute suffocating darkness. But the darkness did not last. Because the Vector was not just a ship, it was a container of liquid fire. The collision ruptured the tanks of the Vector. Thousands of gallons of gasoline and kerosene poured out instantly. But they didn't just pour into the sea. The friction of the metal grinding against metal, the sparks flying from the tearing steel, it acted as a detonator. This was not a slow leak. This was an eruption. The fuel ignited. In the blink of an eye, the world turned from black to red. The cargo of the Vector exploded. But it wasn't just an explosion in the air. It was an explosion that coated everything. The fuel sprayed. It splashed onto the decks of the Doña Paz. It coated the water surrounding the ships. Most shipwrecks are stories of water. The Titanic, the Lusitania. These are stories of cold, of rising tides, of drowning. The story of the Doña Paz is different. It is a story of fire. The ocean, the one place where you expect to be safe from burning, became the fuel source. The fire didn't just stay on the ships. It spread out across the surface of the sea. The oil slick expanded rapidly, carrying the flames with it. Paquito Osabel, in the darkness of the deck, felt the impact. He felt the ship shudder, and then, before his mind could process the concept of a collision, he saw the light. Not the electric light of the ship, but a primitive, roaring orange glow that rose up from the water and consumed the night. The heat hit him before the sound of the explosion fully registered. The sea was no longer a refuge. The sea was burning. And in that moment, the grand ambition of the machine, the schedule, the ticket, the promise of arrival, collapsed. The complex structure of civilization, with its bridges and captains and radars, vanished. What remained was a primal binary choice presented to 4,000 souls in the span of a single breath. Stay and burn, or jump into the fire. The seconds before impact were gone. The seconds of survival had begun. And for Paquito Osabel, standing on a tilting deck surrounded by screaming strangers, the nightmare had not just arrived. It had ignited. The water, the element he had trusted to carry him home, had turned against him. The calm sea was gone. Now there was only the inferno. Fire has a sound. It is not the crackle of a campfire, comforting and small. When 11,000 barrels of petroleum ignite all at once, the sound is a roar. It is a physical pressure, a low-frequency vibration that you feel in your chest more than you hear with your ears. It is the sound of the atmosphere ripping apart. On the deck of the Doña Paz, the world had dissolved into orange chaos. The collision had cracked the tanker open like an egg, and the fuel did not just spill, it sprayed. It coated the sea, but it also coated the decks of the ferry. The fire was instantaneous. It leaped from the tanker to the ferry in a single breath. The paint on the bulkheads blistered and peeled in seconds. The steel plates, cool to the touch only moments before, became hot enough to sear skin. Panic is a contagion. It moves faster than fire. On the overcrowded decks, where families had been sleeping side by side, there was no room to run. The awakening was brutal. People went from deep sleep to absolute terror without the mercy of a transition. The lights were out. The only illumination came from the flames rising from the water, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like monsters. There were no announcements. The public address system was dead. The crew, those who were not killed instantly by the impact or the fireball, were just as lost as the passengers. The authority of the uniform vanished. There was no captain, there was no plan. There was only the heat. Paquito Osabel stood amidst this bedlam. The air was already thick with black smoke, an oily, acrid fog that burned the throat and stung the eyes. He saw people running, but there was nowhere to go. The ship was tilting. The bow of the Vector was still embedded in the side of the Doña Paz, and the two ships were locked together in a death embrace, rotating slowly in the current. The heat was becoming unbearable. It was a radiant intensity, like standing inside an oven. Paquito looked at the life jacket lockers. They were smashed open or people were clawing at them. But the vests, those rigid, ancient blocks of cork and canvas, were useless. Many were decades old, rotted through. Others were tied together in knots that panicked fingers could not undo. And even if you got one, what then? He looked over the railing. This is the moment where the mind recoils. In a shipwreck, the water is the savior. You jump to escape the sinking hull. You jump to escape the fire on board. But looking down, Paquito saw a nightmare. The sea was burning. The fuel had spread out, creating a carpet of fire on the surface of the ocean. It was a ring of hell surrounding the ship. The flames were leaping feet into the air, fed by the slick of gasoline and diesel. To jump was not to escape. It was to leap into a furnace, but the fire on the deck was closing in. The flames were climbing the walls, consuming the luggage, the mats, the wooden crates. The choice was no longer about safety. It was about the type of death. Do you stay and burn on the steel, or do you jump and pray that you can dive deep enough, swim far enough, to break the surface beyond the ring of fire? Paquito chose the water. He did not wait. He did not look for a clear patch, because there were none. He climbed the railing, the metal burning his hands, and he threw himself into the void. The fall takes a second, the impact is hard. He hit the water, and immediately the sensation was confused. The water was cool, but the surface was boiling. He plunged down deep, the momentum carrying him away from the air. He held his breath. He squeezed his eyes shut. Above him, the surface was a glowing ceiling of orange light. He knew he had to swim. He had to get away from the hull, away from the suction of the ships, and away from the burning oil. He kicked, he pulled, he swam underwater for as long as his lungs would allow, his heart hammering against his ribs, his chest burning for oxygen. When he finally broke the surface, gasping for air, the world was a painting of the apocalypse. He had emerged in a gap in the flames, a small patch of black water amidst the burning slick. He wiped the oil from his eyes. The salt stung. The oil stung. Around him, the scene was horrific. The water was filled with people, thousands of them. They were bobbing in the swells, thrashing, screaming. The sound was deafening. It was a chorus of agony. The fire was illuminating faces twisted in terror. Some were burned. Some were covered in black sludge. Mothers were calling for children. Men were shouting names. But the most terrifying thing was the fire itself. It was not stationary. The current was moving the oil. The fire was alive. It crawled across the waves, chasing the swimmers. You could be safe one moment, treading water in a dark patch, and then a swell would push a sheet of burning gasoline right over you. Paquito realized he could not stay still. The ship, the massive Doña Paz, was groaning. It was listing heavily now, consumed by flames from stem to stern. It was a torch in the night. The heat radiating from it was intense, even from a distance. And the vector, the cause of it all, was sinking. He saw debris floating past, suitcases, crates, a child's shoe. He grabbed a piece of wood, something to hold on to, but he let it go. It was charred. Everything was covered in the slick. The oil was everywhere. It was in his mouth, tasting of chemicals and death. It coated his skin, making it impossible to grip anything. He had to move. He had to swim. He turned his back on the burning ships. He turned his back on the screams. This is the hardest part of survival, the selfishness it requires. To live, you must separate yourself from the dying. You must ignore the hand reaching out if it means you will be pulled under. You must focus entirely on the rhythm of your own limbs. Paquito began to stroke. The water was choppy, agitated by the wind and the displacement of the sinking vessels. He was wearing his clothes, pants, a shirt. They were heavy, sodden weights dragging him down. He kicked his shoes off. He thought about stripping further, but the water was cold beneath the layer of fire, and the oil was irritating his skin. He kept his clothes. He swam breaststroke, head up, keeping the oil out of his nose, watching the fire. Behind him, the Doña Paz was dying. The fires had reached the fuel tanks of the ferry itself. Explosions rocked the hull. The steel groaned, a sound like a dying animal. And then, with a final, shuddering lurch, the great ship began to slide backward. It did not take long. A ship that size should take hours to sink, but the damage was catastrophic. The Doña Paz slipped beneath the waves less than 2 hours after the collision. It went down quickly, taking thousands of trapped souls with it. When the ship disappeared, a strange thing happened. The light changed. The massive torch was gone. Now, the only light came from the burning patches of oil still floating on the surface. The darkness of the ocean began to reclaim the scene. The screams began to fade. This is the grim mathematics of a disaster at sea. At first everyone is shouting, but shouting takes energy. Treading water takes energy. The cold begins to seep into the muscles. The shock sets in. One by one the voices go silent. People slip under, they give up, or they drift away, separated by the currents. Paquito swam. He did not know which direction land was. He only knew that away was the only direction that mattered. He swam until his arms burned. He swam until his legs felt like lead. Time distorts in the water. There is no clock. There are no landmarks. There is only the rhythm of the breath and the stroke. 1, 2, breathe. 1, 2, breathe. He was not alone, but he was isolated. He would occasionally bump into bodies. Sometimes they were alive, thrashing feebly. Sometimes they were still. He tried not to look. To look was to acknowledge the reality, and reality was paralyzed by fear. He had to stay in the space of action. Hours passed. The fires on the water began to burn out, dispersing into smaller and smaller flickers, until the night was almost total. Now the terror was different. It wasn't the heat. It was the depth. He was floating over thousands of feet of water. He was a speck in the Tablus Strait. The silence returned, heavier than before. The only sound was the lap of water against his ears and the distant fading cries of others. The physiological toll on a swimmer in the open ocean is immense. First the adrenaline fades. The panic that gave you super strength evaporates, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. Then the cold sets in. Even in tropical waters, the body loses heat 25 times faster in water than in air. Hypothermia creeps in slowly. It starts with shivering. Then the shivering stops, and a dangerous warmth spreads through the limbs. The mind becomes fuzzy. Paquito fought the fuzziness. He thought of his family. He thought of the ground. He created a mental image of the shore even though he couldn't see it. He found a piece of debris, a small raft, or perhaps a piece of the ship's internal structure. It wasn't enough to climb onto, but it was enough to rest his arms on. He clung to it. He was not the only one. There were others clinging to driftwood, to suitcases, to each other. Whispers in the dark. "Help me." "Where is the boat?" "I can't hold on." The conversations were brief, stripped of all social niceties. They were the raw data of survival. Then the rumors started. In the silence, the mind invents new horrors. Someone whispered the word, sharks. The Tablus Strait is deep water. It is known for strong currents. Whether there were sharks there that night is a matter of debate. But to the people in the water, the threat was real. Every brush of a piece of seaweed against a leg sent a jolt of electricity through the nervous system. The fear of predation is primal. It wakes you up. It forces you to keep moving, to keep your legs up, to huddle together. But huddling was difficult. The oil made everything slippery. You couldn't grip a hand. You couldn't hold a shoulder. You were greased. You were isolated by the very substance that had tried to burn you. Paquito drifted. He paddled. He tried to conserve energy. The night seemed to stretch out forever. This is the longest night. It is the period between the adrenaline of the crash and the hope of the dawn. It is the time when the will to live is tested most severely. Hallucinations began. It is common for castaways. The brain, starved of sensory input and flooded with toxins from the smoke and fatigue, begins to project. Paquito saw lights that weren't there. He heard engines that were just the wind. He saw the shape of a boat, but when he swam toward it, it dissolved into a patch of foam. He spoke to himself. He prayed. The prayer was a rhythm, matching his kicking legs. It was a way to keep time. A way to remind himself that he was still a thinking, feeling being, and not just another piece of debris. He wondered if anyone knew. Did the authorities know? Was there a rescue operation launching from Manila? Was the Navy on its way? He didn't know that the distress signal had never been sent. The radio on the Doña Paz had been unmanned or destroyed instantly. The Vector had no radio to speak of. The world did not know they were burning. The silence on the radio waves was absolute. To the outside world, the Doña Paz was simply late. It was a delay, a mechanical issue. No one looked at the clock and thought tragedy. They thought inconvenience. So Paquito was on his own, he and the scattered remnants of the 4,000. He realized that waiting for rescue might be a death sentence. The current was strong. It was pulling them. If it pulled them out into the wider sea, they would never be found. He had to swim. He had to keep moving. But moving was agony. His muscles were cramping. The salt water he had swallowed was making him nauseous. The burns on his skin, minor ones from the radiant heat, or chemical burns from the fuel, were throbbing. He stopped swimming for a moment. He let his legs hang down. It felt so peaceful to just stop. The water supported him. The struggle was so hard, and the peace of surrender was so close. All he had to do was exhale, just let the air out of his lungs. He would sink. The pain would stop. The cold would stop. It is a seductive voice. The voice of the deep. It whispers that fighting is pointless. It tells you that you are small and the ocean is big, and the outcome is inevitable. Paquito listened to that voice. He felt the pull, and then a wave slapped him in the face. Salt water up the nose, a cough, a spasm. The body rebelled against the mind's resignation. The survival instinct, ancient and stubborn, kicked in. He spat the water out. He kicked his legs. Not yet. He looked up at the stars. The smoke had cleared enough to see them. They were indifferent, cold points of light. They offered no navigation he could understand. But they were there. The world was still there. He decided to make a deal with himself. He would swim for 10 strokes, then rest, then 10 strokes, then rest. He broke the impossible task of survival down into manageable units. He didn't have to survive the night. He just had to survive the next 10 seconds. And then the next 10. Around him, the crowd had vanished. The thousands of heads that had dotted the water in the glow of the fire were gone. They had dispersed or they had drowned. He was in a small cluster of survivors now, maybe a dozen people drifting near each other, linked by the invisible thread of shared misery. They didn't speak anymore. They just breathed, gasping, ragged breaths. Paquito watched the horizon. He was looking for a change in the color of the sky, a graying of the black, the promise of the sun. But the night in the tropics is long. It sits heavy on the water. It feels solid. He swam through patches of thick, congealed oil. It coated his hair, his ears. It made him heavy. He felt like he was turning into something else, a creature of the oil, a monster of the deep. He wasn't Paquito Osabel, the man with the ticket, the man with the family. He was just a heartbeat in the dark. He kept kicking, and slowly, imperceptibly, the black turned to charcoal. The charcoal turned to slate. The line between the sea and the sky, which had been erased by the night, began to reform. Dawn was coming. But dawn is not rescue. Dawn is just light. And what the light would reveal was a horror that the darkness had mercifully hidden. The sun would not bring warmth, not yet. It would bring clarity, and clarity in the middle of a graveyard is a brutal gift. Paquito shielded his eyes against the rising gray. He was still swimming. He was still alive. But as the sun crested the horizon, painting the oil-slicked water in shades of bruised purple and dirty gold, he saw what lay around him. And he realized that surviving the night was only the first chapter of the ordeal. The ocean was quiet. The fire was gone. But the dead were everywhere. Light is usually a gift. We are creatures of the day, wired to find comfort in the sun, to believe that when the shadows retreat, the danger retreats with them. We tell children that the monsters disappear when the sun comes up. But in the middle of the Tablas Strait, on the morning of December 21st, the light did not bring comfort. It brought the truth. And the truth was a landscape so grotesque that the darkness felt in retrospect like a mercy. When the sun finally breached the horizon, it was not the brilliant tropical dawn of a travel brochure. It was filtered through a haze of smoke and evaporating chemicals. The light was grey, flat and sickly. It illuminated a sea that had lost its rhythm. The water was heavy. It was covered in a thick, gelatinous layer of bunker oil, black and viscous, undulating slowly with the swell. Paquito Osabel blinked his stinging eyes. The salt and the oil had crusted his lashes together. He had to pry them open with his fingers. He looked around, hoping to see the fleet of rescue ships, the helicopters, the organized might of the civilized world coming to save them. He saw nothing but the ocean and the dead. This is the image that stays. This is the image that refuses to leave the mind long after the burns have healed. The water was crowded, but it was silent. Bodies were floating everywhere. They bumped against each other in the current. They bobbed in the oil slick like macabre buoys, men, women, children. Some were burned beyond recognition, turned into charcoal statues by the initial flash of the explosion. Others looked peaceful, untouched by the fire, their lungs simply filled with water, floating face down, arms drifting loosely at their sides. The scale of it was impossible to comprehend. In the night, the screams had suggested hundreds. In the day, the silence confirmed thousands. The debris fields stretched for miles. Suitcases popped open, spilling clothes that were now sodden and black. A child's plastic doll face up, staring at the sky. Crates of mangoes, the fruit bright yellow against the black sludge, rotting in the salt. Paquito realized then that he was swimming through a graveyard. The relief of survival was instantly replaced by a profound, hollow loneliness. He was a speck of life in a universe of death. He saw other survivors. They were few and far between, heads poking out of the black water, faces masked in oil, eyes wide and white with shock. They didn't wave. They didn't call out. They just stared. They were too exhausted to celebrate the morning. They were simply waiting. The oil was hardening on their skin. As the sun rose higher, the heat began to bake the sludge. It trapped the heat against their bodies, sealing their pores. It smelled of sulfur and gasoline, a stench that coated the back of the throat and made every breath a struggle against nausea. It took hours for the first ship to arrive. It was not a Navy destroyer. It was not a Coast Guard cutter. It was a passing inter-island vessel, the Don Sulpicio, and other smaller merchant ships that had heard the silence where the Doña Paz should have been. When the rescue ship appeared, a looming wall of rust and white paint, a collective gasp went up from the scattered survivors. It was the first sound of hope in 8 hours. But rescue is not like the movies. It is not graceful. Paquito swam toward the hull. His limbs were heavy, his muscles seizing with every stroke. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the night was gone, leaving him with a body that felt like it belonged to someone else. He reached the side of the ship. Ropes were thrown down. Nets were lowered. Climbing a cargo net when you are dehydrated, covered in oil, and in shock is a Herculean task. Paquito grabbed the rough hemp. His hands slipped. The oil acted as a lubricant. He had to wrap his arms through the holes, using his elbows, his chin, anything to gain purchase. Sailors leaned over the rail, shouting encouragement, their faces twisted in horror at the sight of the people emerging from the slime. He was hauled up. Hands grabbed his wrists, strong, dry hands. He was pulled over the railing and collapsed onto the steel deck. He couldn't stand. He lay there, coughing up black water. He looked at his own skin. He was black from head to toe. He looked like a creature birthed from the earth's core. Around him, other survivors were collapsing. Some were weeping. Some were screaming in pain as the air hit their burns. Sailors were running back and forth with blankets, with water, with towels, trying to wipe the oil from faces, trying to find veins to insert IVs. But mostly the crew of the rescue ship stood at the railing, looking down. They were counting. 1, 2, 10, 20. They waited for more. They scanned the horizon with binoculars. They looked for the hundreds of people who should have been there. The count slowed. Then it stopped. Out of 4,000 people, only 26 would be plucked from the sea. Paquito was one of 26. The math was so brutal, so absolute, that it felt like an error. The sailors looked at each other. "Where are the rest?" they asked with their eyes. The ocean answered with its slow, oily rolling. "They are here," it seemed to say. "They are mine." The journey back to shore was a blur of pain and noise. The hum of the engine, which had been a comfort the day before, was now a trigger. Every vibration felt like a precursor to another explosion. Paquito huddled under a blanket, shivering despite the heat. The oil was scrubbed from his skin with harsh detergents, leaving it raw and red. The physical pain was sharp, but the mental landscape was a fog. When they reached the port, The reality shifted from the elemental to the bureaucratic. The disaster on the water was over. The disaster on land was just beginning. News travels slowly in a world without the internet, but panic travels fast. By the time the rescue ships docked, the rumors had already swept through Manila and the provinces. The Doña Paz is missing. There was a fire, a collision. The pier was a siege. Thousands of people, relatives, friends, parents, children, had gathered at the gates of the shipping line, at the hospitals, at the Coast Guard offices. They were pressing against the chain-link fences, shouting names, holding up photographs. "Have you seen my son?" My wife was on the boat. She was wearing a red dress. My father. My daughter. Paquito was offloaded into an ambulance. He was a witness to the second tragedy, the tragedy of the list. The authorities released the official passenger manifest. It was a neat, typewritten document. It listed 1,500 names. It was posted on walls. It was read over the radio. Families scanned the list, fingers tracing down the columns of names, and then the wailing began. Not because they found the names of their loved ones, but because they didn't. He called me before he boarded. He said he was on the ship. I bought the ticket for her myself. They are not on the list. The gap between the paper reality and the physical reality tore the country apart. The shipping lines insisted on the manifest. The government insisted on the manifest. It was the legal truth. If a name wasn't on the paper, the person wasn't on the ship. But Paquito knew. The other 25 survivors knew. They told the reporters, they told the police, they told anyone who would listen. The ship was full. We were sleeping in the corridors. We were sleeping on the deck. There were 3 people for every cot. The uncounted dead, the invisible passengers. They were the poor, the students, the extra children, the people who had paid cash on the gangway to a crewman who pocketed the money. They had died in the fire, and now they were being erased from history. To the system, they had never existed. They had never boarded, they had never burned. This is a specific kind of violence. To die is one thing. To be denied your death is another. In the days that followed, the investigation began. It was a spectacle of finger-pointing and paper shuffling. Men in suits sat in air-conditioned rooms in Manila, far from the smell of the burning oil, and tried to reconstruct the night. They looked at the Doña Paz. They found a history of negligence, the radio that didn't work, the life jackets that were locked away, the overcrowding that was an open secret, a business model built on the assumption that nothing would ever go wrong. Then they looked at the Vector, and here the tragedy turned into a farce. The Vector was a phantom. The investigation revealed that the tanker was operating without a license. It was not legally seaworthy. The crew was underqualified. There was no lookout on the bridge. The ship had been sailing through one of the busiest shipping lanes in the Philippines at night, carrying 1 million liters of gasoline essentially invisible. It was a collision of 2 broken systems. One system was bloated, greedy, and complacent, the ferry. The other was unregulated, rogue, and invisible, the tanker. They met in the dark, and the innocent paid the price. Paquito watched this from a distance. He was in a hospital bed, his skin swathed in bandages. He was being called a hero, a miracle. But he didn't feel like a miracle. He felt like a ghost who had forgotten to die. The questions from the investigators were clinical. What time was the impact? Did you hear an alarm? Did you see the captain? Paquito answered them. No alarm, no captain, just fire. But the answers didn't seem to satisfy the hunger for a reason. Humans want a villain. They want a single bad man who made a bad choice, but there was no single villain here. The villain was the culture of "it will be fine." The villain was the bribe at the port. The villain was the inspector who looked the other way. The villain was the poverty that forced people onto overcrowded ships because they couldn't afford a plane ticket. The villain was everywhere, and therefore, nowhere. As the weeks turned into months, the sensation of the fire faded from Paquito's skin, but it burrowed into his mind. This is the survivor's weight. It is a heaviness that sits in the chest. He would wake up in the middle of the night smelling diesel. He would hear the screaming. Not the screaming of the dying, but the silence that followed. The silence was louder. He asked himself the question that every survivor asks. Why me? Why did the man next to him, the one who had shared his food, die? Why did the mother holding the baby slip under? Paquito wasn't a strong swimmer. He wasn't a Navy SEAL. He hadn't done anything special. He had just jumped. He had drifted left instead of right. A current had pushed him one way and the fire had gone the other. His survival was random, and that randomness is terrifying. We want to believe that survival is a reward for virtue, or strength, or intelligence. But in a disaster of this magnitude, survival is a lottery. It is an accident. Paquito had to live with the guilt of the accident. He had to walk down the street, feeling the sun on his face, knowing that 4,000 people were still drifting in the currents of the Tabla Strait, or settled in the deep silt of the ocean floor, never to be found. The legal battles dragged on. This is the second phase of the disaster, the slow grind of the courts. The families of the victims wanted justice, they wanted compensation, but the machine protected itself. The shipping line fought back. They clung to the manifest. We are only liable for the people on the list, May, they said. Prove your son was on board, show us the ticket stub. But the ticket stubs were at the bottom of the ocean. The proof was ash. The families formed associations. They marched. They sued. But the legal system in the Philippines, like the maritime system, was slow and porous. Years passed. The settlements offered were insulting. A few thousand pesos for a human life. The price of a television set. The disaster began to fade from the headlines. New tragedies happened. A typhoon, an earthquake, a political scandal. The public attention span is short. The Doña Paz became that ferry that sank. The numbers became statistics. The horror was diluted by time. But for Paquito, it never diluted. He tried to go back to his life. He tried to work. He tried to be a father, a husband. But he was marked. He was the man who came back from the burning ocean. People looked at him differently. They looked at him with a mixture of awe and suspicion, as if he carried the smell of death with him. And in a way, he did. He realized that he could never truly leave the water. Part of him was still there, treading water in the dark, waiting for the sun to rise. The world of the dry land, the world of schedules and traffic and television, felt fake to him. It felt fragile. He knew the secret that the rest of us try to ignore, that the ground beneath our feet is not solid, that the systems we trust are held together by rust and luck, that at any moment, the lights can go out and the fire can start. He saw the ocean differently now. It wasn't a highway, it wasn't a resource. It was a beast that had been briefly asleep and had woken up to eat. One evening, years later, Paquito stood by the shore. He watched a ferry leaving the harbor. It was packed. He could see the silhouettes of people on the decks. He could hear the faint sound of music drifting across the water. It looked exactly the same. The overcrowding, the noise, the casual confidence. Nothing had changed. The Doña Paz was gone. The vector was gone. But the conditions that created them remained. The need to travel. The lack of money. The looking the other way. He wanted to scream at the ferry. He wanted to run into the water and wave his arms and tell them to turn back. Don't you know? He wanted to shout. Don't you know what's out there? But he stayed silent. He knew they wouldn't listen. They had tickets. They had plans. They had the grand ambition of getting home for Christmas. They trusted the machine. And the machine churned on, indifferent to the man standing on the beach, indifferent to the ghosts beneath the keel. The crisis of the Doña Paz was not just that it sank. It was that it didn't change enough. The tragedy was too big to be fixed, so it was compartmentalized. It was filed away as an act of God, rather than an act of man. Paquito turned away from the sea. He walked back toward the lights of the town, but he walked slowly. He walked with the careful, measured step of a man who knows that the earth might give way, that the fire might be waiting around the corner. He was alive, but he was also a witness. And the burden of the witness is to remember what the world wants to forget. The sun had set. The night had returned. And out in the strait the water was black and calm, hiding its secrets, waiting for the next ship to cross the invisible line. History is a map, but it is not drawn to scale. It is drawn by memory, and memory is a selective artist. It magnifies the stories that fit our understanding of the world, and it shrinks the ones that are too messy, too painful, or too poor to matter. If you ask a stranger to name a maritime tragedy, they will say the Titanic. They will tell you about the iceberg, the band playing on the deck, the rich men in tuxedos and the poor Irish in steerage. They will tell you about the hubris of the unsinkable ship. The Titanic took 1,512 souls into the freezing Atlantic. It is a tragedy that has been polished into a diamond by a century of movies, books, and museums. We know the names of the captains. We know the menu of the final dinner. We have romanticized the cold death. But the Doña Paz took 4,386 people into the fire. It is the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history. It claimed nearly 3 times as many lives as the Titanic. And yet, outside of the Philippines, outside of maritime safety circles, the name is often met with a blank stare. There are no blockbuster films about the Doña Paz. There are no traveling museum exhibitions showing the shoes of the victims. There is only a quiet, uncomfortable silence. Why does one tragedy become a legend while another becomes a statistic? Perhaps it is because the Titanic was a tragedy of the elite. It was a failure of the cutting edge, a story about the fall of the mighty. The Doña Paz was a tragedy of the invisible. The people on that deck were not traveling for pleasure. They were not on a grand tour of Europe. They were migrant workers, domestic helpers, students, and farmers. They were people moving from the periphery to the center and back again. They were the gears that kept the nation turning, yet they were treated as cargo. They were invisible before they boarded, and they remained invisible when they died. The lack of a manifest was not just a clerical error, it was a symptom of how their lives were valued. To the system, they were volume. They were revenue. They were not individuals requiring a safety briefing or a life jacket. They were simply there. When we look back at the legacy of that night, we must confront the concept of the paper tragedy. The official death toll stood at 1,500 for days. Then it crept up. Then, as the survivors spoke, as the families gathered, the truth exploded. The number 4,000 is difficult to visualize. It is a small town. It is a stadium section. Imagine a town where every single person vanishes in 2 hours. That is the hole the Doña Paz left in the Visayas. Whole families were erased. There are surnames that simply ceased to exist in certain villages after December 1987. A grandmother, a father, a mother, 3 children, all gone. The lineage ends. The house sits empty. The fields go untilled. The economic ripple effect of losing 4,000 breadwinners devastated communities for a generation. This is the debris field that doesn't wash up on shore. It is the poverty that deepens in the silence of the aftermath. And what of Paquito Osabel? What of the man who survived the fire? Survival is often painted as a triumph. We love the word survivor. It implies strength. It implies that the person fought death and won. But if you sit with Paquito, if you listen to the spaces between his words, you realize that survival is not a victory. It is a sentence. He became a minor celebrity for a time. The media loves a miracle. They wanted to hear how he swam. They wanted the action movie version of the night. How high were the flames? How long were you in the water? Did you see sharks? He told the story. He told it again and again. And in the retelling, something is lost. The horror becomes a script. The sensory details, the smell of roasting meat, the slick feel of the oil, the salt in the throat, get smoothed over by the repetition. He becomes a character in his own life, narrating a story that feels like it happened to someone else. But the body remembers what the voice tries to sanitize. For years, Paquito could not go near the ocean. The sound of waves, which is soothing to most, sounded to him like the prelude to drowning. The smell of gasoline at a filling station could trigger a panic attack that would leave him breathless and shaking. This is the legacy that doesn't make the headlines, the nervous system rewired by trauma. He carried the ghosts of the 4,000. When he looked at a crowd in a market, he didn't see shoppers. He saw the deck of the ship. He saw how easily a crowd becomes a mob, how easily a person becomes a body. He lived with the guilt of the lottery winner. Why did I swim left? Why did I hold my breath longer? Why am I here, eating rice, drinking water, feeling the sun, when the children I saw sleeping on the mats are gone? There is no answer to these questions. The universe does not offer closure. It only offers time, and time moves on. The Doña Paz tragedy forced a reckoning, or at least the appearance of one. There were inquiries. There were speeches in the Senate. Laws were drafted. The maritime industry was scrutinized. The ghost ships like the Vector were hunted down, their owners fined, their operations suspended. But did the sea change? If you go to the port of Manila today, or the port of Cebu or Tacloban, you will see the ferries. They are newer now. They have better radar. The manifests are digitized. There are security guards. But watch closely, watch the holidays, watch Christmas. The crowds still come, they still press against the gates. The desperation to get home is a force of nature that no regulation can fully contain. You will still see the overloading, perhaps not as blatant as in 1987, but it is there. The extra cot in the hallway, the child sitting on the knee, the cargo stacked a little too high. The geography of the Philippines demands these ships. The economics of the Philippines demands cheap travel. And so, the equation remains. The risk is calculated against the ticket price. The passengers still trust the machine because they have no other choice. They trust that the lesson has been learned, but lessons in safety are written in blood, and blood washes away. The Vector, the ship that caused the fire, is a perfect symbol of the modern danger. It was a vessel moving through the dark, cutting corners to make a profit. That dynamic has not disappeared. In a globalized world, the pressure to move fuel, to move goods, to move people faster and cheaper is higher than ever. There are still ships out there with tired captains. There are still ships with rusted hulls. There are still ships sailing with radar that is turned off to save electricity, or crewed by men who are underpaid and overworked. The Doña Paz was not a freak accident. It was the inevitable result of a system that prioritized efficiency over life. And that system is still the engine of our world. So, what is the true legacy of the burning ocean? It is the knowledge that safety is an illusion we agree to maintain. We board the plane, we step onto the ferry, we drive the car, and we wrap ourselves in the comfortable blanket of "it won't happen to me." We believe in the competence of strangers. We believe that the person at the helm is awake. We believe that the inspections were done. Paquito Osabel learned that this belief is fragile. He learned that the line between a routine journey and a descent into hell is razor thin. It is measured in seconds. It is measured in the turning of a wheel. The ocean itself remains the ultimate witness. The Tablas Strait looks the same today as it did on December 19, 1987. The water is blue. The currents run deep. The sharks still patrol the depths. Nature does not commemorate our disasters. It absorbs them. The oil has long since dispersed, eaten by bacteria or washed up as tar balls on distant beaches. The steel bones of the Doña Paz and the Vector are rusting in the dark, hundreds of meters down, slowly being colonized by coral and barnacles. They are becoming part of the geology. But for those who know, the water there feels different. It feels heavy. If you take a ferry across that strait today and you stand on the railing at night looking down into the black water, it is hard not to think of the fire. The phosphorescence in the wake looks like sparks. The humidity feels like heat. Paquito Osabel passed away years after the tragedy, living out a life that was stolen and then returned to him. He died on land, which is a victory in itself. But his story, and the story of the thousands who died with him, serves as a grim lighthouse. It warns us not of the rocks, but of ourselves. It warns us of our capacity to ignore the cracks in the system until they break. It warns us that when we treat people as numbers, the math eventually turns against us. The story of the Doña Paz is not just a story about a ship. It is a story about the fragility of our trust. We trust the steel to float. We trust the fuel to burn only in the engine. We trust the night to be peaceful. But the sea does not sign a contract with us. The fire does not respect our schedules. As the years widen the distance between us and that fiery night in 1987, the details blur. The anger fades. But the image must remain. The image of the ocean on fire. It is a reminder that the elements are wild and we are small. We build our machines, we write our schedules, we count our passengers. But in the end, we are all just travelers on a dark sea, hoping that the lights on the horizon are home and not another ship coming toward us in the night. The water closes over everything eventually. The screams fade, the headlines change, the surface becomes smooth again, reflecting the stars, looking innocent, looking calm. But we know better now. We know what lies beneath the reflection. We know that the sea can burn, and once you know that, you never look at the horizon the same way again.